Okay, let's look at another myth when it comes to functional behavior assessment and positive behavior support. So, this myth is one that's actually pretty common. And this is the, um, I guess, common practice of trying to address behaviors of concern by simply avoiding exposing the person to any and all known triggers. In other words, we think that our approach to supporting the person should be to absolutely eliminate all triggers. And I like to call this the eggshells approach. Because what happens when we attempt to support people with their behaviors of concern by simply avoiding any exposure to known triggers is that we tend to walk on eggshells around the person. We tend to be really worried that anything could set them off, and we spend so much time trying to sanitize the environment so that none of the triggers are ever present. This is an exhausting way to address behaviors of concern. It's also not very realistic. And could we actually consider this to be a more restrictive approach? Because think about it. In our attempt to avoid exposing the person to any and all known triggers, do we inadvertently make their world smaller and smaller and smaller? And we actually avoid also putting them in contexts which may be very preferred and enjoyable because of the fear that a trigger might occur in one of those environments. And so by attempting to remove any and all known triggers, we run the risk of actually making the person's world smaller and smaller and smaller, and actually taking away other opportunities for meaningful participation and social inclusion. So the truth is that to effectively address behaviors of concern, we need to identify triggers, which is part of the purpose of an FBA, and then we should carefully and systematically expose a person to triggers while teaching and reinforcing other new, more adaptive responses. Now, I put the caveat in here, is that some triggers should be eliminated. If the person's trigger has to do with a previous traumatic event or being exposed to abuse or neglect, those triggers for sure need to be eliminated. Nobody should be forced to face potentially harmful situations. Now, what about things like sensitivity, sensory sensitivities to noise, lights, crowds? What do we do in that situation? In some cases, we could work on gradually exposing people to those difficult sources of sensory stimulation and see if they can kind of get used to it. But there's other ways we could address this as well. We could teach a person to wear headphones to block out some of the loud noise. We could teach a person to wear sunglasses or a baseball hat to try to remove some of the light stimulation. I know for me personally, I hate fluorescent overhead lighting. It actually really, I think, negatively affects my attention and productivity. So what I've done is, instead of trying to desensitize myself to the glare of fluorescent lights, which I find highly aversive, I've set up all of my work environments, including my office at work and my office at home, with soft yellow lamp lighting, because that type of lighting is more preferred. So there's a combination of strategies we can use when dealing with triggers that involve, in some cases, completely removing the trigger, but in other cases, teaching a person to come into contact with that trigger while taking steps to make the event less aversive, and allowing the person more access to the big wide world. So let's revisit the purpose of an FBA before we get into more details about positive behavior support. So recall that the purpose of an FBA is to ultimately inform the design of a function-based, skill-based positive behavior support plan. When we say function-based positive behavior support plan, we mean that the support strategies are directly linked to the identified behavioral function. When we say skill-based, we mean that the support strategies emphasize proactively the teaching of new skills. These are new life skills that are going to help the person be more independent, participate in more meaningful activities, and be more socially included. And research consistently tells us that the very best way to help people with their behaviors of concern and to produce meaningful and long-lasting reductions in behaviors of concern is by essentially teaching and richly reinforcing new skills.